R. In the spring of 1942, inside a windowless office in Tokyo, a Japanese intelligence officer finished a report on the new American admiral at Pearl Harbor. The report contained one line that would haunt the Imperial Japanese Navy for the next 3 years. It said something the man's own superiors in Washington had not yet figured out. This is his story, and it is the story of how the enemy understood him better than his own country did. R. The launch cut across Pearl Harbor at first light on the last morning of 1941. The water was black. Not the black of night. The black of oil. Weeks of oil, pooled and slick and refusing to burn off, rising from the wreckage below in slow iridescent breaths. The launch cut a wake through it, and the wake closed behind, and the black settled again as if nothing had passed. Standing in the bow was a man in the plain, khaki uniform of a 56 years old, silver hair, blue eyes the color of the water. On a day the water was still clean. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He looked. To his left, the USS Arizona lay in 40 feet of water, her wreckage rising to within a few feet of the surface, her superstructure crumpled inward where the forward magazine had gone up on the morning of December 7th. More than 900 of her crew were still inside her. Nobody had brought them up, nobody would. To his right, the Oklahoma had rolled onto her side, her hull rising from the water like the back of some vast dead animal. 429 men aboard her when she went. 429. The West Virginia, the California, the Nevada run aground on Hospital Point so she would not sink in the channel and seal the harbor for the rest of the war. 6 ships of the line, sunk or gutted or bleeding fuel into a harbor that had been 4 Sundays earlier, the greatest naval anchorage in the Pacific. More than 2,400 Americans dead in a single morning. The officers waiting on the dock did not smile as the launch drew in. They knew what was left. 3 carriers, a handful of cruisers, a submarine force that had not yet fired a torpedo in anger, and a fleet on the bottom of a harbor that had been theirs. The man in the bow stepped onto the dock. His name was Chester William Nimitz, and he was, as of that morning, the Commander-in-Chief, United States Pacific Fleet. One of the officers present that day, years later, would write down what he saw. Nimitz stood at the rail, he said. He looked at the wreckage for a long time. He did not speak. Then he turned back toward the dock, and he told his staff to get to work. That was it. That was the moment. No photograph exists of it. No headline covered it. Chester Nimitz's arrival at Pearl Harbor was, in the American press that week, a footnote. But what he decided in the first hours of his command would shape the war that most of the men on that dock believed was already lost. And the strangest thing about his story, the thing that still, 80 years later, is not fully told, is not what he did. It is who understood it and who did not. To find Chester Nimitz in the historical record before December 1941, you have to look for a man who was not trying to be found. He had been in the Navy for 40 years. He had never commanded a battleship in combat. He had never led a famous action. He had no political constituency, no cultivated press. He was born in the hill country of Texas in a town called Fredericksburg in 1885. His grandfather ran a hotel. His father died before he was born. He entered the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1901 because he had failed to get an appointment to West Point. 7th in his class of 114, he did not stand out. In 1908, an ensign of 23, he ran the destroyer USS Decatur aground in the Philippines and was court-martialed, reprimand. The reprimand went into his file and it stayed there. In 1909, he transferred to the Submarine Service. This is worth pausing on. The Submarine Service in 1909 was not what it became. It was a punishment posting. It was where careers went to end. The boats were small, gasoline-powered, dangerous. They stank of fuel and vomit. Officers of ambition did not go to submarines. Officers of ambition went to battleships. Chester Nimitz went to submarines. And there, in the cramped hulls of the Navy's smallest, dirtiest, least prestigious vessels, he learned something the men on the battleships did not. He learned what a submarine could do to a supply line. He would remember that For 30 years, he moved through the assignments that ambitious officers avoided. Diesel engines, he taught at the Naval War College. He ran the Bureau of Navigation, which sounds important and is not. It managed personnel files. He was competent. He was quiet. He was the man other officers described when asked as reliable. In the summer of 1939, Franklin Roosevelt considered him for command of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz did not press for it. He said there were more senior men. He said it was not his time. The command went instead to Admiral Husband Kimmel. Kimmel was the man in command on December 7, 1941. Kimmel was the man they had to replace. While Chester Nimitz was disappearing into the machinery of an unglamorous navy on the other side of the Pacific, another man was studying him. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. He was 57 years old in the winter of 1941, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had served as naval attaché in Washington twice. He had traveled across the United States. He had seen for himself what the Americans had built. He had seen the oil fields of Texas. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh. He had seen the Ford plant at River Rouge. And he had gone back to Tokyo, and he had told his superiors in language that made them furious that Japan could not win a long war with the United States. He put it in a letter that has been quoted 1,000 times since. In the first 6 months, he wrote, he would run wild and win victory upon victory. After that, if the war continued, he had no expectation of success. He had said it, he had been overruled, he had done his duty, he had planned Pearl Harbor, he had run the operation. And now, in the first weeks of 1942, as his officers celebrated the greatest naval victory in Japanese history, Yamamoto was reading the American papers. He was looking for a name. The name he found was Nimitz. He did not know the man personally, but he knew the Navy the man came from. He knew the peculiar American habit of promoting quiet, competent officers past louder ones. He knew that Washington, in a moment of crisis, had reached down into the machinery and pulled out a submariner from Texas who had never fought a fleet action. He asked his intelligence officers to prepare a report. The report, according to what historians have been able to reconstruct from Japanese naval records that survived the war, did not focus on ships. It did not focus on strategy. It focused on the man, how he made decisions, what pressures he responded to, whether he could be provoked. The Japanese had been studying the American commanders for years. They had a working file on Admiral William Halsey, whom they understood well. Halsey was aggressive. Halsey was emotional. Halsey responded to insult. Halsey could be baited. Nimitz was different. Post-war historians who examined the surviving Japanese records summarized the assessment, in effect, in a single line. This man does not need to be seen winning in order to win. That, the Japanese analysts concluded, made him dangerous in a way Halsey was not. The report was filed. It was read by the Naval General Staff. It was, over the following months, quietly revised, updated, expanded. In Tokyo, in the winter of 1942, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were beginning to understand something about Chester Nimitz that his own superiors in Washington had not yet grasped. They understood who he was. Washington still thought they had appointed a safe pair of hands. Back at Pearl Harbor in his first week of command, Nimitz did something that no one on his staff had expected. He asked to inspect the submarine base, not the battleships, not the airfields, not the radar installations or the command bunkers or the salvage operations working around the clock in the harbor. The submarines. His aide reminded him gently that fleet was in crisis. There were choices to be made. There were reporters waiting. Nimitz said he wanted to see the submarines. He walked the piers at the submarine base that afternoon. He knew the smell of diesel. He knew the sound of a boat under repair. He knew, from 30 years in that service, what those boats could do if a commander finally let them off the leash, because there was, at that moment, a leash. Before the war, U.S. Navy submarines had been trained in fleet doctrine. or they were to operate as scouts for the battle line. They were to attack warships. On the afternoon of December 7, 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington sent a signal to every submarine in the Pacific: execute against Japan unrestricted air and submarine warfare. The order came from Washington. It did not come from Nimitz. But the order on its own was ink on paper. What it required to become a war was a commander in the Pacific who understood what submarines were actually for, who had been on those boats, who had spent 30 years thinking about supply lines while the rest of the Navy was thinking about broadsides. Chester Nimitz walked the submarine piers that first week. He met the boat captains. He listened to what they needed. He signed the orders that put them to sea, not as scouts for battleships that no longer existed, but as the primary strategic weapon of the United States. Nobody in Tokyo had prepared for the Japanese war plan, developed and refined since the 1920s, was built around a single vision. The Americans would come. They would come in force. They would come as a battle fleet driving across the Pacific, seeking a decisive engagement. Japan would meet that fleet near the home islands in a great battle modeled on Tsushima, and Japan would win, and the Americans would sue for peace. The plan was elegant. It was thorough. It had one flaw. It assumed the Americans would fight the war Japan wanted to fight. Nimitz was not going to. By the end of 1942, American submarines would begin to cut Japan's merchant marine at a rate the Imperial Naval Staff had never modeled. By the end of the war, over 1,000 Japanese merchant ships would lie on the bottom of the Pacific. The tankers, the freighters, the transports that carried the oil, the rubber, the food, the ammunition without which no empire, however proud, can fight. The great decisive battle that Japan had planned for since the 1920s would never come. Chester Nimitz never gave them the conditions for it. Not because he was afraid of a battle. And because he had spent his whole quiet career learning to think about a war. In Washington that winter, the mood was different. The Chief of Naval Operations was a man named Ernest Joseph King. He was 63 years old. He had a jaw like a hatchet and a temper to match. His own daughter, when asked years later what her father was like, is said to have offered a line that has followed him into every history book since. He is the most even-tempered man in the Navy, she said. He is always in a rage. King had been given the wartime title of Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet. He answered only to the president. He believed the Pacific was his war, that the Navy was his instrument, and that to whoever commanded at Pearl Harbor was his subordinate. He had not chosen Nimitz. He would learn to work with him. He would come eventually to respect him. But in those first months of 1942, King wanted action. He wanted headlines. He wanted the Pacific Fleet to strike back publicly and hard at a Japanese empire that had humiliated the United States on a Sunday morning while the country was drinking its coffee. He sent Nimitz signals. He sent them often. Attack, move, show the flag, do something. Nimitz read the signals. He acknowledged them. He did not answer them the way King wanted. He was preparing something. He was not going to explain what. And in Tokyo, in a windowless office of the Naval General Staff, an intelligence officer reading the American signals traffic made a small note in the margin of his file. The new man at Pearl Harbor, the note said, is not acting the way we expected an American commander to act. We should not assume he will. We should watch him. 6 months later, in a place that was not yet on most Americans' maps, a place called Midway, the watching would end. And Chester Nimitz, the quiet man from Fredericksburg, Texas, who had never commanded a battleship in combat, would be asked to make a decision that, if he was wrong, would leave the west coast of the United States undefended. He would make it in silence. He would make it in a basement, and he would make it not by listening to Washington, but by listening to a man in a basement who had spent 6 months breaking a code that most of the U.S. Navy did not believe could be broken. The basement was under the old administration building at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. You reached it down a flight of concrete stairs, past a Marine sentry who checked your name against a list, through a steel door that stayed locked. Inside, the air was stale. There were no windows. There was no daylight. The lights were fluorescent tubes that hummed and flickered and cast everything the color of old paper. R, the man who ran the room, was 41 years old. His name was Joseph John Rochefort. He had joined the Navy in 1918 as an enlisted sailor. He had learned Japanese in the 1920s on a 3-year assignment in Tokyo. He had a mind for patterns, for repetitions, for the small tells inside a language that most listeners never heard. He had run a code-breaking unit in Washington. He had been shipped out to Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1941 to build one from nothing. His unit was called Station Hypo, Combat Intelligence Unit, 14th Naval District. Nobody outside the basement knew what it did. Rochefort worked 18 hours a day, sometimes 20. He slept on a canvas cot in the corner of the room. He wore a red smoking jacket over his uniform because the basement was cold, and slippers on his feet because he had stopped bothering with shoes weeks ago. His hair had gone gray. He had lost weight. His team was smaller than it needed to be. Cryptanalysts, linguists, radio intercept operators, yeomen running punch card machines that clattered day and night. They worked in shifts. They rarely went outside. The war, for them, was columns of 5-digit numbers on flimsy paper, pulled from the air off Japanese naval frequencies and dropped in wire baskets on Rochefort's desk. The code was called JN-25. It was the operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It had been considered unbreakable. Rochefort's team had been breaking it since before the war. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough. Fragments, call signs, ship movements, R, weather reports, a code group here, a partial decrypt there. By the spring of 1942, they were reading, on a good day, perhaps 10 to 15% of what the Japanese sent. 10 to 15%, if you know how to listen, can be enough to hear a war coming. R, in May of 1942, Rochefort heard one. Something was moving, something large. Traffic volume on Japanese naval frequencies had climbed sharply. New call signs were appearing. Old ships were checking in from new positions. The combined fleet was assembling for something, and the something was not small, and it was not far away. A designation kept recurring in the intercepts, 2 letters, AF. AF was the objective. R, Rochefort's team had been tracking Japanese geographic names for months. They had a working list. They knew H was Oahu. They had a growing sense of what letter meant what atoll, what letter meant what strait. And by early May, they had come to believe with growing certainty that AF was Midway. Midway, a speck. 2 small islands and a coral reef, 1,100 nautical miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. A Marine garrison, an airstrip, a radio station, named Midway because it was more or less halfway across the Pacific. If Rochefort was right, Yamamoto was coming for Midway. If Rochefort was right, the Japanese were about to commit their entire combined fleet, 4 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, a screen of cruisers and destroyers, an invasion force, an occupation force, everything against a target that most Americans could not have found on a map. If Rochefort was right, the war was about to turn. He sent his assessment up the chain, and Washington disagreed. The Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington was designated OP-20G. It was, on paper, the senior code-breaking authority in the United States Navy. It had its own reading of the traffic. It had its own theory. AF OP-20G said was not Midway. AF might be Johnston Island, or possibly the Aleutians, or possibly, some analysts argued, a diversion cover for the real Japanese objective, which was the American West Coast. The West Coast. San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles. If Rochefort was wrong and Washington was right, and Nimitz sent his last 3 carriers to Midway on the strength of one man's guess, there would be nothing between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the beaches of California. The stakes are hard to convey now, at this distance. Try to feel them the way the men in that room felt them. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Our Yorktown, which was limping into Pearl Harbor with her hull cracked and her flight deck buckled from the Battle of the Coral Sea a week earlier. 3 carriers against 4 Japanese fleet carriers already at sea. 3 carriers, which, if lost, could not be replaced for a year. And a decision that had to be made now. Chester Nimitz sat in his office at the Pacific Fleet headquarters. He read the assessment from Washington. He read Rochefort's assessment. He asked to see Rochefort's intelligence officer.
Yeah.
The intelligence officer's name was Edwin Layton. He was 39 years old. He had served with Rochefort in Tokyo in the 1930s. He had known him for a decade. He trusted him. Nimitz sent for Layton. Layton came. They spoke for a long time. What was said in that room has been reconstructed from Layton's own account, given years later. Nimitz asked one question. He asked it quietly. He asked whether Layton was certain. Layton said he was. Nimitz asked him to prove it. The trick that came next has passed into legend, but it happened, and it happened the way legend says it did. Rochefort's team suggested a test. They would have the Marine garrison at Midway send an uncoded radio message in the clear reporting that the island's freshwater distillation plant had broken down. If AF was Midway, the Japanese would pick up the message. They would relay the information to their own commanders in a coded transmission that Rochefort's team was already reading. The message was sent. Within days, Rochefort's team intercepted a Japanese naval signal. Decoded, it referred to AF being short of fresh water. Nimitz had his proof. He had 2 weeks. He gave the order, Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet, under the command of a rear admiral who had never fought a carrier action in his life. His name was Raymond Ames Spruance. He was 55 years old. He was a cruiserman, not an aviator, not a naval strategist of any public reputation. He had come up through gunnery and destroyers. He had, until 3 days before the operation began, been commanding a division of heavy cruisers, and no one outside the fleet had ever heard of him. The reason Spruance was at Midway at all was that Admiral William Halsey, who had been slated to command Task Force 16, had been hospitalized with severe dermatitis on May 26th and was covered in weeping sores from the neck down. Halsey, from his hospital bed, recommended Spruance. Nimitz agreed. The naval aviation community was not pleased. Cruiser Admiral, commanding 2 of America's last carriers in the largest fleet action of the Pacific War. Against Yamamoto himself, there were whispers, there were memos, there were senior aviators who said openly that it was a mistake. Nimitz let them talk. He had made his decision. Task Force 17, built around the wounded Yorktown, would be commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher was 57, a Medal of Honor recipient, a veteran of Coral Sea. He would be the senior officer at sea, the overall tactical commander coordinating both task forces. Yorktown was still in dry dock when Fletcher received his orders. The ship should have been out of the war for 3 months. The dockyard workers of Pearl Harbor were told they had 72 hours. They did it in 72. Yorktown steamed out of the harbor on May 30th. Welders still working on her decks. Sparks still flying, ready to fight. Nimitz stood on shore and watched her go. He would not see the battle. Commanders-in-chief do not sail with the fleet. He would sit in his headquarters in a small office with a large map, and he would wait. He had bet everything. Rochefort in a basement, breaking a code Washington did not believe he had broken. Spruance in a task force in an ocean he had never fought in, against an enemy that outnumbered him. Yorktown wounded and welded and steaming west because Nimitz had told her to steam west. If any part of it failed, the war was lost. Nimitz went back to his office. He did not tell anyone how he felt. He sat at his desk. He waited. The Battle of Midway was fought over 4 days, from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. I will not tell you all of it. What matters for the story of Chester Nimitz is what happened in the middle. The morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway. The American torpedo squadrons launched from the American carriers attacked the Japanese fleet. They flew low and slow. They were massacred. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet put 15 planes into the air Every one of them was shot down. Every man in it died except one. That was 10 in the morning. At approximately 10:02, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers off Enterprise, found the Japanese fleet by chance, having flown to the edge of his fuel and turned north on a hunch and dove. 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, the American dive bombers put their bombs through the flight decks of the Kaga and the Soryu, and the 3 Japanese carriers were burning. Later that afternoon, aircraft from Yorktown found the 4th carrier, Hiryu, and set her on fire too. Yorktown was hit. Yorktown was hit again. Fletcher aboard the cruiser Astoria, after transferring off his burning flagship, sent Spruance a message. R. The message was, in effect, 4 words. You take tactical command. Spruance, the cruiser admiral, took it. He made the decision that night not to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet toward its own battleships. He turned east. He held his carriers back. Some of his aviators and some of his own staff thought he was wrong. He was right. R. 2 years later, they would say he was wrong again in the Philippine Sea, and he would be right again, and the Japanese, planning against him, would build an entire operation around the belief that they had finally understood him. They had not. But that was 2 years away. At Pearl Harbor, on the afternoon of June 4th, Chester Nimitz sat at his desk and read the incoming signals. 4 Japanese carriers burning, the combined fleet in retreat. R. The war in the Pacific, without anyone yet fully understanding it, had just turned on its axis. Nimitz sent a signal to the fleet. It read, "You, who participated in the glorious page in our history." Then he went back to work. There is no photograph of him receiving the news. There is no film. He did not stage one. He did not think to. He was already that afternoon thinking about the next problem. R. The next problem was called Guadalcanal. You have to picture Guadalcanal to feel it. It is not a picturesque island. It is a jungle. It is malaria. It is rain that comes down in sheets for weeks and then stops for an afternoon and then comes down again. It is snakes and crocodiles and a river the Marines called the Lunga. It is, in August of 1942, the place where a half-finished Japanese airstrip is sitting under the trees. When the airstrip is finished, Japanese bombers will fly from it. When Japanese bombers fly from it, the supply routes between Australia and the United States will be cut. The Marines were sent to take the airstrip. Around 11,000 of them landed on the beaches on August 7th, 1942, under a Marine general named Alexander Archer Vandergrift, 55 years old, a Virginian. A veteran. R. A man who understood that the difference between a landing that succeeded and one that did not was often a matter of nothing more than luck. They took the airstrip in the first 2 days. They named it Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway, Major Lofton Henderson. Then they held it. They held it in August. They held it in September. Or they held it in October, when supplies ran so short they were eating captured rice with weevils in it, and each Marine on the perimeter carried, dealt on his belt, whatever ammunition he could keep dry. They held it while Japanese destroyers ran down the slot between the islands every single night, so reliably that the Marines named the route the Tokyo Express, and every morning there were more Japanese soldiers on the island. Or they held it while the American Navy, having lost 4 heavy cruisers in a single night at Savo Island on August 9th, pulled back its surface ships and left the transports offshore to unload what they could and steam away. They held it in the dark, alone, without air support after sunset, without a navy on the horizon, and the man responsible for supporting them, the vice admiral in command of the South Pacific area, was Robert Gormley. R. Gormley was 59 years old, a competent officer, a man of the fleet. He ran his command from a transport ship anchored at Noumea in New Caledonia, 600 miles from Guadalcanal. He never visited the island. His signals to Pearl Harbor grew darker through September and darker through October. He wrote of a situation that was, in his own words, critical. He recommended that Washington reconsider its commitment to the island. Nimitz read the signal in his office. He did not answer it in writing. He got on an airplane. R. He flew to Noumea himself. He spent a day reviewing every signal, every report, every dispatch that had come out of the South Pacific Command since the Marines landed in August. The officers present said Nimitz did not raise his voice. He asked questions. He listened. He read. When he flew back to Pearl Harbor, he had made two decisions. Gormley would be relieved of command. Guadalcanal would not be abandoned. He chose William Halsey to replace Gormley, not because Halsey was a better strategist. He was not. Not because Halsey was more thoughtful. He was not that either. He chose Halsey because Halsey would fight with what he had, and fighting with what he had was exactly what the situation required. The orders were flown out by messenger boat to Halsey's flagship at Noumea Harbor on October 18th, 1942. Halsey opened the envelope. He read the orders. He read them again. He looked up. He said aloud, so that his flag lieutenant heard him and remembered it, this sentence: Jesus Christ and General Jackson, this is the hottest potato they ever handed me. He took command that afternoon. Nimitz did not announce the change. His name did not appear in the papers that week. There was no press release. There was no ceremony. Gormley was gone. Halsey was in. The Marines on Guadalcanal, who did not know what had happened at Pearl Harbor, would not know for weeks. They would only notice that the signals coming from the fleet had changed, that the tone had changed, that the Navy, which had felt very far away in September, had begun to feel, in November, like it was on its way. This was the method. The method was quiet. The method was to make the decision and to let the decision be the announcement. There is a pattern here that the Japanese, studying it from Tokyo, would not identify for another 2 years. Spruance at Midway, Halsey at Guadalcanal, two commanders, two temperaments, nothing alike, one patient, one a hammer. Nimitz had put the patient man where patience won and the hammer where a hammer was needed, and the fleet did not understand yet that this was a system. It was not that Nimitz had a style. It was that Nimitz refused to have one. He matched the man to the situation. Every time, not to the situation he wished he had, to the situation he had. The Japanese, whose entire doctrine of command was built on rigorous training toward a single ideal of the officer, could not read this pattern. There was only no pattern to read. There was only judgment applied fresh to conditions that were never the same twice. They kept trying to plan against him. They kept building operations around what an American commander would do. They kept being wrong. On the night of November 13th, 1942, in the black waters off Guadalcanal, a small American force intercepted a Japanese battleship group coming down the slot to shell Henderson Field. Nimitz had almost nothing to send. 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 8 destroyers, under Rear Admiral Daniel Judson Callahan, 52 years old, a San Francisco man. The Japanese force had 2 battleships. The ships met at close range in the dark. The battle lasted a little over half an hour. It was, one participant later said, like a bar fight with pistols in a phone booth. Callahan was killed on the bridge of his flagship, the San Francisco, when Japanese shells struck her superstructure. 2 American cruisers went to the bottom. 4 destroyers went with them. Hundreds of men went into the water in the middle of the night, and some of them were not pulled out for days. But the Japanese battleship Hiei was mortally damaged. She was finished off the next day. The resupply convoy behind her turned back. Henderson Field was not shelled that night. The airstrip held. Nimitz sent Callahan's ships in knowing what would likely happen to them. He sent them because there was no one else to send, because the alternative was to let Guadalcanal fall. He did not talk about it afterward. He almost never talked about the ones who died. Vandegrift, on the island, later wrote something worth remembering. Throughout the entire Guadalcanal campaign, he wrote, he never received a signal from Pearl Harbor suggesting that withdrawal was an option. He wrote it as a compliment. It was also a description of how Chester Nimitz worked. Quietly, without drama, removing the option he had already decided not to take. In April of 1943, 5 months after the last Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal had been broken, Rochefort's team in Hawaii intercepted another message. Yamamoto was flying. The combined fleet commander was going to inspect forward bases in the Solomon Islands. His itinerary had been transmitted in JN-25. It included the exact time his aircraft would land at Balalai near Bougainville on the morning of April 18th. The signal reached Nimitz. He held it in his hand. To kill Yamamoto, he would have to send fighters up from Guadalcanal, a flight of roughly 1,000 miles round trip, and he would have to send them with certainty because the fighters would arrive at the intercept point at the exact minute Yamamoto's aircraft would arrive, and if the fighters arrived at the wrong minute and the Japanese survived, they might realize their code was broken. If they realized their code was broken, they would change it. If they changed it, the American war in the Pacific would go dark. Nimitz sent for Leighton. Leighton had known Yamamoto personally. He had met him in Tokyo in the 1930s when Leighton was a young attaché and Yamamoto was a rising senior officer. They had drunk together. They had spoken in Japanese for hours about the American Navy and the Japanese Navy and the war both of them were beginning to think was coming. Nimitz asked Leighton that April a question that has been recorded almost the same way in every account of it. He asked whether the Japanese could replace him with someone better. Leighton, who had spent years thinking about the men in the Imperial Japanese Navy, gave his assessment. No other Japanese admiral, he said, held the same stature. No other admiral had the same experience. No other admiral commanded the same respect. In effect, he told Nimitz, they cannot replace him. Nimitz approved the mission. 18 P-38G Lightning fighters, launched from Kukum Field on Guadalcanal, flew a wide loop out over the ocean at wave-top height to avoid Japanese radar. Arrived at the intercept point over Bougainville at 9:34 in the morning, 1 minute early. Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down over the jungles of Bougainville on the morning of April 18th, 1943. The man who had studied Nimitz, the man who had gone to Harvard, the man who had driven across America and come back to Tokyo and told his superiors they could not win a long war. The man who had understood Chester Nimitz better than the Imperial Japanese Navy, was killed by an Operation Nimitz, approved using intelligence from a code Yamamoto had trusted, executed with the precision that had become Nimitz's signature. Quiet, careful, final. Yamamoto had spent 2 years watching Nimitz. Nimitz had been watching him back the whole time. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific had turned. The Japanese were no longer advancing. The Americans were no longer defending. Island by island, atoll by atoll, the perimeter of empire was collapsing inward toward Tokyo. In June, Nimitz sent Fifth Fleet to take the Mariana Islands. Hundreds of ships, nearly 1,000 carrier aircraft, more than 100,000 men. The commander was Spruance again. The same Spruance who had taken tactical command at Midway when Yorktown burned. 57 years old now, still walking miles every morning before his staff arrived, still at his desk before anyone else in the building. The Japanese had assembled their largest carrier force since Midway, 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, a plan called AGO. It was designed around one specific assumption about the American commander. The assumption was that Spruance would not leave his landing force undefended to chase a carrier battle. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, built the entire operation on that belief. His carriers would strike from beyond American aircraft range. His planes would land on Guam after their attack, refuel, strike again on the way back. The whole plan required Spruance to behave exactly the way the Japanese had predicted he would. On the night of June 18th, Spruance received a message from his carrier commander, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. Mitcher was 57, one of the finest carrier officers the Navy had ever produced. His chief of staff, Captain Arleigh Burke, was 42, a destroyer man who would go on to become one of the most respected officers in American naval history. Mitcher's message requested permission to take the carriers west overnight to be in strike position by dawn. Burke supported the request. The case was simple. Move now. Hit them first. End the threat. Spruance, read the message. He refused. R. His orders were to protect the Saipan landings. He would not leave them undefended to chase a carrier battle whose exact location he could not confirm. He would wait. R. The Battle of the Philippine Sea began the next morning, June 19th, 1944. Japanese aircraft attacked in waves. Flying superior aircraft against undertrained enemy pilots destroyed them so completely that the American pilots afterward called it the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. On June 19th alone, roughly 346 Japanese aircraft were shot down. Over the 2 days of the battle, Japanese air losses would climb to nearly 600. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, 2 of them, the Taiho and the Shokaku, by American submarines. The third, the Hio, by air attack. It was, by any measure that the fleet used, a decisive American victory. It was also, in the view of nearly every senior officer around Spruance, a missed opportunity. Mitcher was furious. Burke later called Spruance's refusal to move west a serious error of judgment. Vice Admiral John Towers, the deputy commander of the Pacific Fleet, wrote a formal letter to Nimitz demanding that Spruance be relieved of command. The letter was specific. The argument was detailed. Towers had the support of most of naval aviation. Nimitz read it. He did not respond in writing to Towers. He did not address the letter with Spruance. R. A month later, Admiral King, on a visit to Saipan, pulled Spruance aside. He said, in words that Spruance and others later remembered clearly, that Spruance had done a fine job, that his decision had been correct, and that whatever anyone else was saying about it, King stood behind him. Towers never received a reply to his letter. Spruance himself was not sure he had been right. R. Years later, writing to the historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, he put it plainly. He said, in effect, that he had thought about it many times, and that going out after the Japanese carriers would have been more satisfying. But they had been at the start of a very important amphibious operation, and they could not afford to gamble. He had doubted himself. He had said so in writing. The man who defended him had not doubted him for a moment. R. And the Japanese, when they studied the battle afterward, understood something the Americans arguing about Spruance had missed. Ozawa had built his plan around understanding Spruance. He had been right about the man. The plan had failed anyway, because Spruance did not need to be aggressive to win, because Nimitz had put him there because he did not need to be aggressive. R. Because reading a commander was not the same as reading the man behind the commander, and behind Spruance stood Nimitz, and behind Nimitz stood something the Japanese could not model. A system that would not commit itself to any style, and therefore could not be planned against. They had spent 2 years trying to understand it. They were beginning finally to understand it. By the time they did, it was too late. R. There is a story about Chester Nimitz that does not appear in most books about him. It is not a story about a victory. It is a story about a room in Honolulu 4 when the President of the United States came to visit. Franklin Roosevelt arrived on the cruiser Baltimore. He was 2 years old. He was 62 years old. He was less than a year from death, though nobody in that room knew it yet. He was pale. He was thin. R. His hands trembled when he held a cigarette. He had come to Hawaii to settle an argument between 2 of his commanders. The argument was about the shape of the war. On one side was Chester Nimitz, 59 years old now, silver-haired, still quiet. On the other side was General Douglas MacArthur, 64, corncob pipe, aviator, sunglasses, every syllable of every sentence rehearsed for an audience. The question was where to strike next. Nimitz, following the strategic thinking pushed by Admiral King in Washington, argued for Formosa, the large island off the Chinese coast that the modern world calls Taiwan. Take Formosa, the argument went, and you cut Japan from her oil, her rubber, her tin, everything she had conquered in Southeast Asia. Skip the Philippines. Skip the long, expensive campaign through Luzon and Leyte and Mindanao. Go for the throat. R. MacArthur wanted the Philippines. He had left them in 1942 with a promise. He would return. He had said so on newsreels. He had said so in speeches. He had said it most famously in a single sentence that had run in every newspaper in America: "I shall return." Roosevelt sat in a chair in a mansion on Waikiki Beach and listened to them both. MacArthur spoke at length. He spoke about honor. He spoke about the millions of Filipinos still under Japanese occupation. He spoke about the American promise. He spoke, as always, in the voice of a man who had already written the history books that would be written about him. Nimitz presented the naval case, oil supply lines, the fastest, most economical path to Tokyo. The president listened. The president weighed the arguments. In the months that followed, the campaign to retake the Philippines went forward. Formosa was set aside. Nimitz went back to Pearl Harbor and started planning the campaign he had presented against. Years later, after the war, after everything, Nimitz would concede in his own quiet way that the Philippines plan had proven itself, that MacArthur, whom he had disagreed with for decades, had made his case, and it had held up. He would not defend himself in memoirs. He would not write a book to explain his position. He would not tell his side of the story. He would say, in effect, that the decision had been made, that the men who fought the Philippines campaign had done what was asked of them, and that was the end of it. That is not a story most Americans have heard, but it is true, and it matters because it tells you something about the man that no story of a victory could tell you. Chester Nimitz was not always right. He was only always honest. On the morning of September 1845, the battleship Missouri sat at anchor in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. It had ended 16 days earlier when Emperor Hirohito had spoken on the radio to the Japanese people. His voice, thin and formal, had told them that the war had not gone in Japan's favor and that they must, in the words of the Imperial Rescript, endure the unendurable. Now the Missouri was in Tokyo Bay to make it official. Her decks were crowded, officers from every allied nation, photographers, newsreel, cameramen, correspondents from a dozen papers. On a table on the deck, a document waited. 2 pages, signatures required from a delegation of Japanese officials and from representatives of 9 allied nations. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the microphone. He spoke for several minutes. He spoke about civilization, about the generations to come, about the meaning of the moment. He spoke well. He always spoke well. Then he called the Japanese delegation forward. The foreign minister, Mamoru Shigemitsu, went first. He was 67 years old. He had lost his right leg to an assassin's bomb in Shanghai in 1932. He removed his top hat. He leaned on his cane. He limped to the table. He signed. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound on the deck of that battleship, for a long moment, was the sound of an old man with a wooden leg writing his surrender in careful characters on a document he had not written. Then came the representative of the Imperial General Staff. Then MacArthur signed. He used a series of pens. He set each one aside as he finished a stroke so that he could give the pens away afterward to people he had chosen to honor. One of them went to General Jonathan Wainwright. Wainwright had commanded the American forces in the Philippines after MacArthur left in 1942. He had surrendered Corregidor. He had spent more than 3 years in a Japanese prison camp. He had arrived at the ceremony that morning, still visibly thin, still gaunt, his uniform hanging. Then it was Nimitz's turn. He stepped to the table. He signed on behalf of the United States. As he stepped back, he did not speak. He did not look at the cameras. He did not gesture. One of the correspondents watching from the rail later described the moment as almost unnoticeable. Nimitz had signed, he had stepped away, and the ceremony had moved on. That was the whole moment. The war was over. Chester Nimitz went about his duties. In the weeks that followed, back at Pearl Harbor, he sat down to write his final report on the war. It ran to hundreds of pages. It covered every major campaign from December 1941 to August 1945. He named the correct decisions. He named the operations that had succeeded and explained why they had. He noted the failures. He did not name the men responsible for them. That was a choice. He made it deliberately. The war was over. The men who had failed already. They would live with it. He did not need to add his name to the list of accusers. He submitted the report to the Navy Department. It received no press coverage. There is a photograph of him from around this time. It is not a famous photograph. You will not have seen it. It shows Nimitz at a desk in his office at Pearl Harbor. He is in uniform. He is reading something. Papers are spread across the desk in front of him. He is not looking at the camera. The caption in the Navy archives reads simply, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz at work. It does not specify what work. It did not need to. From the last day of 1941 to the last day of the war, he had sat at desks like this one. He had read the dispatches. He had reviewed the assessments. He had made the decisions that no photographer was present for, while other men stood at microphones and accepted the credit that his decisions had made possible. That was how he preferred it. That was how it had always been. After the war, when the shooting was over and the surrender was signed and the Japanese Empire was being disassembled by lawyers and generals in Tokyo, American intelligence officers went into the archives of the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff. They found something worth reading. The Japanese had kept files on their American opponents throughout the war. Not brief files, deep files, continuously updated. Revised as the balance of power shifted, rewritten as new information came in. They had a file on MacArthur. The file on MacArthur, according to historians who have examined the surviving records, focused on his sensibilities, his relationship with Washington, his use of the press, his obsession with the Philippines. The Japanese had understood MacArthur early and understood him well. They had known what to expect from him, and they had been, in many cases, correct. They had a file on Halsey. The file on Halsey focused on his aggression, his predictability under pressure, the patterns his staff had identified that had allowed the Japanese at Leyte Gulf in October of 1944 to draw him north with a decoy carrier force while their surface fleet slipped through San Bernardino Strait to strike at the American landing beaches. Halsey had gone. He had taken the bait. The trap had failed only because other American forces, most famously the escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy III, had held their ground against overwhelming odds. The Japanese had understood Halsey too. Then the intelligence officers pulled the file on Nimitz. The file on Nimitz was different. It was not that it was longer. It was not that it was more detailed. It was that it was, in a way, the officers reading it had trouble putting into words, unresolved. The Japanese analysts had tried to find a pattern in his appointments. Every time Nimitz chose a commander for an operation, the Japanese had studied the choice. They had asked themselves what it meant. They had tried to derive from it a theory of how Nimitz thought. Spruance at Midway, Halsey at Guadalcanal. Spruance again at the Philippine Sea. Halsey again at Leyte Gulf. The pattern would not come together. Spruance was patient. Halsey was aggressive. Nimitz had used them both. He had used the patient one in situations that required patience. He had used the aggressive one in situations that required aggression. There was no formula. There was no doctrine. There was no rule you could isolate and plan against. There was only judgment. The Japanese file on Nimitz returned again and again to a single conclusion. The analysts had revised it several times. But the final assessment said, in effect, this man cannot be provoked into acting before he is ready. This man matches the commander to the situation, not to the situation he wishes he had. This man has no style. He has only judgment. You cannot plan against judgment. They had spent 4 years trying. They had lost the war doing it. By the time the war ended, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost every fleet carrier that mattered, the 6 that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the carriers built or converted to replace them, all of them on the bottom of the Pacific. Her battleships were sunk or permanently disabled. The Yamamoto, the largest battleship ever built, had gone down in the East China Sea in April of 1945. On a suicide sortie toward Okinawa, killing nearly all of her crew of more than 3,000. Her sister, Musashi, had gone down at Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. The WWII that Nimitz had ordered Callaghan's small force to intercept in the dark off Guadalcanal had gone down at the cost of hundreds of American lives, but she had gone down. More than 1,000 Japanese merchant ships lay on the ocean floor. The tankers, the freighters, the transports that had carried the oil and rubber and food and men that had made the empire possible. Cut down, one by the submarines Chester Nimitz had put to sea in his first week of command, when the harbor around him was still burning. The decisive naval battle that the Imperial Naval Staff had planned for since the 1920s, the battle modeled on Tsushima that Japanese officers had trained for their entire careers. That battle never came. Nimitz had never given them the conditions for it, not because he was afraid of the battle. He was not afraid of the battle. He had sent Callaghan into the dark, battleships. He had sent Spruance into an ambush at Midway. He had sent Yorktown to sea with welders still working on her decks. He had never once, in 4 years of war, shown fear of a battle. He had refused the battle they wanted him to fight because he understood something that the men who had planned Pearl Harbor, for all their skill, had never fully absorbed. The goal was not to win the battle. The goal was to win the war. Those are not always the same thing. We are. And the man who keeps them separate, the man who can hold the larger objective steady while the pressure to respond, to attack, to be seen doing something builds from every direction, from Washington, from the newspapers, from his own subordinates, from the enemy trying to bait him into a mistake. That man is harder to defeat than any weapon. Chester William Nimitz died on the evening of February 20, 1966. He was 80 years old. He died at his quarters on Yerba Buena Island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, in the naval housing where he had lived out his last years. The same Navy that had been his home for more than 6 decades had provided the rooms where he closed his eyes for the last time. His funeral was 4 days later, on February 24th, 1966. That was the day he would have turned 81. He was buried at the Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, not at Arlington. He had not asked for Arlington. He had asked for something else. He had asked to be buried near his friends. Before he died, Nimitz had made an arrangement with 3 other men, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, Admiral Charles Andrews Lockwood. Admiral Charles Andrews Lockwood, Spruance, who had won Midway, who had refused to chase Ozawa in the Philippine Sea, who had walked miles every morning before his staff arrived, who had, until his own death, wondered if he had been right. Turner, who had commanded the amphibious landings across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Iwo, Jima, Okinawa. The admiral who put the Marines on the beaches, Lockwood, who had commanded the submarine force in the Pacific. The man who had run the war on Japanese shipping that Nimitz had put in motion in his first week of command. The man whose submarines had put those 1,000 merchant ships on the bottom of the ocean. The 4 of them had made a pact. They would be buried together, in a row, in the ground, the way they had worked together in the war. Nobody arranged it for the newspapers. Nobody staged it for a photograph. The 4 graves are still there now. You can go and see them if you drive to San Bruno. 4 white headstones in a row in a national cemetery on a hill overlooking the Pacific. 4 men who ran a war and preferred, in the end, to be near each other. That was what they had wanted. That was what they got. If you drove down to that cemetery today, you would find nothing to mark Chester Nimitz apart from the men beside him. No monument, no obelisk, no inscription praising his greatness. His stone is the same standard issue white marble that marks every American grave in every national cemetery in the country. His name is on it, his rank, the dates of his life, nothing else. That was the choice he made. He could have had more. He could have had a memorial in Washington. He could have written a book. He could have appeared on television in his later years and told his story to a public that would have listened. He did not. He went home. He read. He walked with his wife, Catherine, whom he had married in 1913 and who had waited for him through every deployment. He did the work. Then he stopped and he let the work speak and he trusted the rest to time. R. There is a chance that a name in your family tree connects to this story. A grandfather on a destroyer, a great uncle in a submarine, a father who came home from the Pacific and did not want to talk about it. If he came home at all, he came home because of decisions men like Chester Nimitz made, decisions that were never in the newspapers. If your grandfather served in this war, or if your father came home with, he told at the dinner table and nowhere else. If there is a name in your family that the history books did not record, leave it in the comments. The name, the branch, the theater, if you know it, the ship, if he was Navy, the unit, if he was Army, the base, if he was a mechanic in the rear who kept the aircraft flying. Those men did not fight for headlines. Or they fought so that the people sitting where you are sitting right now, in whatever room you are in, would never have to. The least we can do is say their names. Do not let them disappear.